So I think it's time we start talking about what happened to your parents. Like the truthful version.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay. What?
Because listen to me. This is the only chance you're going to have to tell us the truth. I can't tell you what we know, but we know you're not telling us the truth. We know your parents are no longer with us. Okay? And we know the reason why. Okay? You need to tell the truth. Listen. You need to tell the truth about what happened and just tell us why it happened. Okay?
In a quiet stretch of Wisconsin, where neighborhoods look the same from one block to the next and most families blend into the background of everyday life, the Haldersons looked like the kind of family nobody would ever expect to see in the news. They had routines, plans, and a son who seemed to be going places. Chandler Halderson presented himself as ambitious, focused, and already halfway to a successful future. He told people he was in college, talked about impressive opportunities, and described a life that sounded like it was moving forward fast. If you're someone who enjoys stories that peel back the surface of what looks normal, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because this case is exactly that kind of story. To friends and even to some family members, Chandler's life sounded busy and important. He spoke confidently about classes, about work, about plans that stretched far beyond the small town he came from. Social media helped reinforce that image, the way it often does, turning words into something that feels real just because they're repeated often enough. His parents, Bart and Krista, believed they were supporting a son who was building something meaningful. From the outside, it looked like a typical story of a young man getting ready to step into adulthood. But every carefully built image depends on one fragile thing: consistency. And in this case, the story Chandler told the world was only as strong as the lies holding it together. Small details didn't quite line up. Schedules were vague. Explanations were sometimes too smooth, too rehearsed. Still, most people don't expect the worst from someone they trust. That's how these stories usually begin, quietly, with no warning signs that feel serious enough to stop everything. If you think cases like this are important to tell and to understand, take a moment to like and share this video, because what comes next isn't just about one family. It's about how easily a false life can be built, and how dangerous it can become when the truth starts closing in. At this point, no one knew that the perfect story was already beginning to crack. At first, the cracks in Chandler Halderson's story were so small that they were easy to ignore. A missed class here, a vague answer there, explanations that sounded reasonable if you didn't look too closely. He continued to talk about school and work as if everything were normal, as if his life were moving forward exactly the way he said it was. But the problem with a life built on lies is that it requires constant maintenance, and even the smallest mistake can start a chain reaction. Behind the scenes, the reality was very different. There were no classes to attend, no real job to report to, no future plans that existed outside of conversations. Every day required another story, another excuse, another layer added to keep the image intact. Over time, the effort to keep everything straight becomes exhausting, and people close to you begin to notice when things don't quite match up. In the Halderson home, questions started to appear, not as accusations at first, but as simple attempts to understand schedules, paperwork, and plans. This is the part of stories like this that often gets overlooked. Long before anything officially goes wrong, there's usually a quiet period where tension builds and trust starts to erode. If you're finding this kind of deep dive into real cases interesting, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because these are the moments that explain how everything else becomes possible. Pressure doesn't usually arrive all at once. It accumulates. For Chandler, every unanswered question meant more risk. Every request for proof meant another chance for the entire story to collapse. The world he had invented was starting to demand evidence, and invented worlds can't provide that for long. What had once felt like harmless exaggeration was turning into something much more serious, something that couldn't be talked away forever. And as the distance between the story and the truth kept growing, the situation inside that house was becoming more unstable by the day, even if no one yet realized just how close it was to breaking. The moment everything shifted was when Chandler told authorities that his parents had suddenly left for a holiday weekend trip and never came back. On the surface, it sounded like a simple missing persons case, the kind that happens more often than people realize. Adults leave, plans change, phones die. But almost immediately, the story began to feel off. Timelines didn't line up cleanly, details were fuzzy, and the explanations felt more rehearsed than worried. Investigators did what they always do first. They started with the basics. They checked when Bart and Krista were last seen, when they were last heard from, and whether there was any sign they had actually gone where Chandler said they were going. And that's when the first serious problems appeared. There were no confirmed sightings, no messages, no digital traces that matched the story. In a world where almost everyone leaves a trail of data behind, the absence of that trail can be just as telling as its presence. As the questions piled up, attention naturally turned back to the person who had reported them missing. Chandler continued to talk, continued to explain, but the story seemed to shift in small ways each time. If you're following this case so far, make sure you're subscribed, because this is where modern investigations really start to show how powerful, simple facts and timelines can be. You don't need drama when the details speak for themselves. Police began checking phone data, locations, and recent movements, not just of the missing couple, but of Chandler as well. Piece by piece, a picture started to form, and it didn't match the version of events they had been given. What was first treated as a search slowly started to feel like something else entirely, something much more serious. By this point, the case was no longer just about finding two people who hadn't come home. It was about figuring out why the story around their disappearance didn't make sense, and who might be trying to make sure the truth stayed hidden. The calm surface of the situation was giving way to something far darker, even if no one was saying it out loud yet. As investigators kept working through the timelines and digital records, the case began to narrow in a way that felt almost inevitable. Each new piece of information didn't stand on its own. It connected to something else, forming a pattern that was becoming harder and harder to ignore. Locations, messages, and movements were compared side by side, and the version of events Chandler had described simply couldn't survive that kind of scrutiny. What made this part of the investigation so powerful was how ordinary it all was. There was no single dramatic clue that solved everything at once. Instead, it was a steady process of checking, confirming, and eliminating possibilities. When something was proven impossible, it stayed impossible, no matter how confident the explanation sounded. That's how real cases often work, and if you appreciate seeing how careful, step-by-step investigations come together, this is a good moment to like the video and share it with someone who enjoys this kind of deep dive. Slowly, the focus of the case shifted. This was no longer about searching outward for answers, but about looking much closer to home. Statements were compared to evidence. Evidence was compared to records. And each comparison made the gap between what had been said and what could be proven even wider. The story that had once seemed complicated was actually becoming very simple, just not in the way anyone would have wanted. When the case moved into the courtroom, the narrative was no longer built on theories, but on documentation, data, and testimony. The prosecution's approach wasn't about emotion or speculation. It was about showing how a life built on false claims had finally collapsed under the weight of reality. One by one, the layers of the story were stripped away, leaving a version of events that was grounded in facts rather than words. By the end of this phase, there was very little left to argue about. The question was no longer what had happened, but what the consequences would be. And for the first time since the story began, the future was no longer something that could be talked into a different shape. It was something that was about to be decided. When the trial reached its final stage, there was a sense that the story had already been told, not through dramatic speeches, but through records, timelines, and the quiet weight of accumulated facts. The courtroom wasn't a place for the kind of stories that can be adjusted or reshaped. It was a place where only what could be proven mattered. And what had been proven showed a life that had been built on false claims, finally collapsing under its own weight. The verdict brought the long process of questions and investigation to an end. The sentence that followed made it clear that this was not a misunderstanding, not a mistake that could be corrected later. It was a permanent consequence for a permanent set of choices. If you stayed with this story from the beginning, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, because cases like this aren't told for entertainment alone. They're told to remind people how real the outcomes of deception and bad decisions can be. What's striking about this case isn't just how far things went, but how they started. There was no single moment where everything suddenly went wrong. There was a slow drift away from the truth, one lie supporting another, until the distance between reality and the story being told became impossible to manage. That's often how these stories end, not with one shocking turn, but with the inevitable result of many smaller choices. If you think it's important that stories like this are told carefully and responsibly, make sure to like and share this video. The goal isn't to glorify anything that happened here, it's to understand it, and to remember that the pressure to appear successful or to live up to an image is never worth the cost of losing everything. In the end, what remains is a warning more than a mystery, a reminder that truth has a way of catching up, and that no matter how carefully a false life is built, it can't stand forever.